Wow. Good afternoon, everyone. So wonderful to see such a great turnout for this webinar. Maybe let me just start by thanking you all, our partners, employers, brokers, trusted allies for your support throughout last year. We wish you health, prosperity, and happiness in 2021. So I think we can all accept now that we're in for COVID 2021. We guess much of what we experienced last year will stay with us, and we do experience some new challenges. To assist us in navigating what appears to be something that we're going to have to live with for a while is Dr. Ron Whelan. Dr. Ron is the Chief Commercial Officer for Discovery Health, but in this context specifically, he's the leader and the head of the COVID-19 task team for Discovery. Dr. Ron will be really assisting us in navigating the implications of the second wave, potentially the third, where we are in terms of South Africa's plan, in terms of deploying the vaccine. And lastly, he will also facilitate just ongoing discussions. We do invite you to engage with us on the question and answer platform. We'd like to hear your thoughts, so please use that functionality. We'll periodically check on it, and we will hopefully have an opportunity once Dr. Ron has taken us through his presentation to answer some of those questions. Looking forward to this session and looking forward to your engagement throughout. Over to you, Dr. Ron.
Many thanks for the introduction, Zonke. Yeah, eloquent as usual, much appreciated. And good afternoon to everyone. A good Friday afternoon. A good Friday afternoon, certainly nice and warm in Johannesburg. I hope it's warm in your parts of the country as well. I'm delighted to be with you here this afternoon to give you an update, as Zonke says, on the second wave, on the variants, plus on vaccine update. As you know, Discovery's been working closely with the National Department of Health, as well as colleagues in the business sector through B4SA and BUSA. It's been a frenetic 2 or 3 months on the vaccine front, in amongst trying to navigate the second wave, as I'm sure you've been trying to navigate as well. So welcome to the session. I hope it's going to be helpful. I'll try and move through the presentation as quickly as possible so that we can get to questions at the end, and hopefully this will be of use. We'd lump up the presentation to get going. Zonke, can you just confirm that the presentation is up and displaying correctly?
It is. Thanks, Ron.
Okay, good stuff. Okay, so let's get going. As Zonke mentioned, I'm Chief Commercial Officer at Discovery Health. I've also been leading Discovery's COVID response, both internally and externally, over the last now pushing 11 months or so. So I run two jobs, and then I sit as on the committees for the various structures around vaccine program in South Africa. I said to you, we're going to cover 4 things: the second wave, variants, vaccines, and staying safe. Given COVID is not going to be going away for 2021, it's important that we reiterate some of the safe messaging. So we've got a few pages on that just to update you on staying safe. But we'll focus on second wave and vaccines with a quick update on variants. Starting with the second wave, this may be a slide that's familiar to you. I've used it here previously. I typically bring it up at the start of presentation just to remind ourselves on how these pandemics typically play out. So this is the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. You see there 1918, 1919. What's uncanny about the Spanish flu pandemic is this is a UK statistic. So the UK in 1918 had a first wave in June, July. As you recall, the UK had a first wave in about March, April in 2020. The UK then had in 1918 a second wave in October, November. This is identical to what happened with COVID in the UK this year. And the peak is almost identical to what happened with COVID this year. Then it dropped off around January, February, and we're seeing a slow drop off in the UK, notwithstanding the new variant in the UK. And then they had a further smaller third wave around about March. So there is a good chance that, and South Africa, by the way, has had a similar picture. This actually looks very similar to a South Africa picture. So a pretty good chance that we will see a third and potentially a fourth wave. But typically, the thirds and fourth waves are significantly lower than the second. So hopefully, we are through the worst of the storm. Where South Africa is today is infections have dropped by 37% off their peak. So you'll see that we peaked at 31.5 new infections per 100,000 population per day. That's equivalent to 19,000 new infections a day. 19,000 new infections a day. We're now down to 13,000 new infections a day. So it's still an extraordinarily high number. But the good news is it does look like we've come off the peak, and we've come off the peak quite quickly. We're now at equivalent levels to where we peaked in wave one. And we all recall the wave one peak. The health system was under pressure. Our businesses were under pressure. So we're at a roughly an equivalent level. Hopefully this trajectory sustains itself and we continue downward. But I must warn that the UK saw a similar trajectory 2 weeks after their peak, and then they shot up sharply. And we saw similar trajectories in Ireland. So please, we must be careful over the next 2 weeks or so. And in fact, over the course of the first half of this year. Taking that chart and just extrapolating it across all of the 9 provinces, this is the first wave across all of the 9 provinces. The dark green line is the South Africa line. This is the second wave across all of the 9 provinces. And what you'll notice from this chart here is that just about all of the provinces are on a downward trajectory, which is terrific, terrific news. And in many cases, a very steep downward trajectory. If you look at the Western Cape, it looks like it's almost fallen off a cliff there, that gray line. So Western Cape infections, daily infections are down 50% now, which is really, really good news. And we're seeing positivity rates here drop off there. KwaZulu-Natal also down significantly, which is great. And then I think my favorite one on this chart is that Gauteng is trending down, which is even better news and hopefully stays that way. We were very worried about Gauteng with travelers returning from various parts of the country after December holidays. But we need to be ultra vigilant in Gauteng over the next a month or two. Ultra vigilant. We don't want this one to spike up again. Comparing the first wave versus the second wave, so this is a piece of analysis Discovery has done. The solid lines are the first wave. The second wave. The dotted lines are the first wave. So if you look at Western Cape here, for example, the blue dotted line is the national statistics. So those are the public sector statistics. National includes public sector and private sector. The orange line or orange dotted line is Discovery Health data. So this was the first wave trajectory in the Western Cape, Discovery Health versus national. And what you'll see is the second wave, both for Discovery, orange line, as well as for national, was significantly higher, much higher second wave in the Western Cape in the second wave compared to the first. In fact, about 2 to 2.5 times higher. And that's why hospitals came under pressure in the Western Cape so significantly, in particular in areas like the Garden Route. Interestingly, the Eastern Cape picture is slightly different. So the Eastern Cape, remember the dotted line is the first wave, the solid line is the second wave. Discovery Health data was roughly the same in the first wave and in the second wave. The orange lines are Discovery data, and national data was roughly the same in the first wave and the second wave. So the Eastern Cape had a very severe outbreak in PE and Buffalo City, but actually on aggregate, the first and second waves are roughly the same. Gauteng, on the other hand, or equally, is at about, you can see the Discovery numbers for Gauteng are almost identical, first wave to second wave, and nationally, the numbers are almost identical. So Gauteng's outbreak has almost been a mirror image in the first wave to second wave. And then without going into detail around the other slides, 2 times, the KwaZulu-Natal outbreak was 2 times as high in the second wave, or twice as high. Limpopo outbreak was 6 times as high in the second wave. And Mpumalanga outbreak was about 3 times as high in the second wave. So that's kind of how it's played out at a provincial level. From a Discovery perspective, this is hospital admissions per day. So you'll see in the first wave here, Discovery Health was recording 300 new hospital admissions a day. So 300 Discovery Health members admitted every day for COVID at the peak of the first wave. At the peak of the second wave, and as I say, we hope it was the peak of the second wave, we were recording over 500 new hospital admissions a day. So that's 70% up on the first wave. And we felt this pressure across the system during the course of December and January. Yeah, we had significant pressure in KZN, significant pressure across the Garden Route in Western Cape, and significant pressure across Gauteng. We were working hard to ensure that members got hospital beds. The system got very, very tight on hospital beds, ventilators, ICU, oxygen capacity. It was very, very tight and very, very scary over the course of New Year. Fortunately, we have dropped off. So you'll see that we're now somewhere around 400 new admissions a day. But 400 new admissions a day is still 25% higher than the first wave. So while we've have navigated the last 2 or 3 weeks, which has been really tough, we are still nowhere, not out of the woods yet. I think the other point I want to make on the slide is at the peak of the second wave, we made sure that everyone who needed a hospital bed got a hospital bed. If you needed an ICU bed, you got an ICU bed. In fact, we flew Discovery Health members out of the Garden Route, out of KZN, out of PE, into other regions just to make sure that everyone who needed a bed got a bed. This is the trajectory around hospital admissions across the different provinces to give you a sense on how it's planning out. So the blue line is Gauteng, the yellow line is KZN, and the orange line is Western Cape. It's from 1st of December to 18th of January. And as you'll see, daily hospital admissions peaked in Gauteng around about the 10th of January. So that's just on a week ago. So up until a week ago, I was certainly very busy with hospital beds, and you could feel that in your phone ringing just about every hour. KwaZulu-Natal peaked somewhere in the beginning of January, and Western Cape has sort of been flattening over time. The good news is it looks like it's on the downslope, but as I said all along, we've got to be very, very cautious now, and we cannot afford to go back up to the peak hospital admission levels. It's the system barely coped at that level. From a mortality perspective, as you'll see from this chart here, the brown line is Discovery Health case fatality numbers. So this is the number of deaths, number of Discovery deaths divided by the number of Discovery COVID infections. And you'll see all along the mean case fatality rate has been about 1.9%, which is below the national average. The national average is 2.7%. So that's good news for Discovery members. And I think it's testament to the care that people get across the healthcare system. What's interesting about this chart is you see when we started out in May, how mortality rates dropped from May through to July. So that's almost a 25% drop off in mortality rates. And if anyone asks you whether the lockdown was worth it or not, you've got to show them this slide. Because we locked down, we had time to prepare our healthcare system, and more importantly, had time for the science to emerge on how to treat COVID. And because we knew how to treat COVID, we were able to reduce mortality rates by almost 25%. And you can just imagine how many lives we saved during this period and then throughout as a result of that. Moving on to variants, and this is a very hot topic at the moment. So we clearly have some variants emerging. This is natural for viruses. So viruses do mutate over time. They're usually small mutations, but variants mean they're slightly bigger mutations. So this is what's starting to play out. Happens in all pandemics, happens with viruses all the time. A quick recap on what the coronavirus looks like. This is a very close-up picture of a coronavirus, or an illustration of a coronavirus. There's three important components to this. The first one is these RNA strands. You see these yellow strands in the middle of the coronavirus. That is the RNA sequence, the code. That's what makes the coronavirus. And a mutation happens when there's a change in the code around any of these strands here. If you can see my arrow on the page there, there's a small mutation that results in a different manifestation. And I was trying to think of how I explain this best to you. Imagine I say to you, I write one sentence that says, Emily went to the dentist. And then in my next sentence, I just changed the Y in Emily to an E in Emily. Now it becomes Emil went to the dentist. And this is what happens when you see mutations. Emily suddenly becomes Emil. And that's a tiny, tiny error that happens in the DNA code. And through that change, the virus then begins to change here slightly, and it has a different impact on the system. So that's what we mean by a mutation. I've spoken previously about this protein lipid core, this blue layer here. This is unique to the coronavirus. Typically, viruses have a protein core, which is a very hard shell, almost like a tortoise shell. You can imagine that's full of your protein. Because the coronavirus has got lipid, it means that soap can get in there and dissolve the lipid. And that's why washing your hands with soap and water is equally effective to alcohol detergent here for alcohol solutions for coronavirus. And then you've got these interesting little spike proteins, these red proteins, glycoprotein spikes. Those are basically the landing points. So those spikes then attach to the cells in your body, and that's how it lets and then it releases the DNA into your cells. So these things are important. These things are also important in that the vaccines are being developed against these glycoprotein spikes. So the vaccines are designed to elicit a response in the back of glycoprotein spikes. So that's these little red blobs. That also gives it this sun-like look, and therefore it's called the corona. Corona is the Greek word for sun. So that's a quick view. So now what's happened with the variants? Well, what are we talking about here? As you remember from the previous page, you've got this RNA in the middle here. Certain parts of the RNA produce different parts of the coronavirus. In the same way, in our human bodies, there's a certain part of your DNA that creates your nose, and there's a certain part of your DNA that creates your ears, or your mouth, or your tongue, or all these strands of DNA create different things. What's happened here is that this portion here creates the spike protein. You see the spike protein? That portion of the RNA creates the spike protein. And what's happened is there's been a mutation along that spike RNA. It's called the N501Y mutation. I'm not going to go into any more detail on that, otherwise we're way, way too deep on this. But other than to say, this mutation in the RNA has altered the composition of the spike protein. Fortunately, it's a very, very small alteration, tiny, tiny alteration. It's a few proteins that have changed. So it hasn't changed materially, but it is having some impact on infectivity, which we'll talk about in the following slides. There are three mutations that have been identified globally, and they are all, and this is very important, they are all on the N501Y mutation, all there. They've just been labeled differently across countries. So what's called the B117, this is the British version, the so-called British mutation, is actually 501Y version 1. So that's actually 501Y version 1. This is 501Y version 2, and this is 501Y version 3. This one appeared in England first. This one appeared in South Africa first, and this one has just appeared in Brazil. So we have three slightly different mutations in the same part of the coronavirus across three different locations. And what we're seeing is a spread of these mutations across the globe. And that's natural to see as people continue to travel across the globe. So just wanted to clarify that there's three specific mutations. They're all in the same place. Slight differences between the three. The important thing on this is that the mortality rate between the mutations doesn't seem to be different. And we've analyzed both the national data as well as the discovery data. So the variants don't seem to be creating any more deaths. This is a page on mortality rates from the Western Cape, so hospital mortality rates. I'll just show you the above 70 examples. So this was the mortality rate in early wave 1 in hospitals, and this is the mortality rate in wave 2 in hospitals in the Western Cape. It's an insignificant difference. So it's a 0.5% difference. Statistically, it's not significant. And then you've got the mortality rates late wave 1 and the mortality rates in the trough. Those things there, they might look more spread on the chart, but are not actually spread out statistically. And so I think we're comfortable that the new variants don't cause additional death. What the new variants do, however, do is they're more infectious. And in fact, more infectious is more dangerous than being more deadly. This is a chart from the London School of Public Health. What it illustrates here is this is the normal trajectory. So this is of the normal version of the coronavirus. That gray line there is the deaths as a result of the normal version of the coronavirus. What they've demonstrated for us here, which I think is very clever, is the difference between increasing the mortality rate. So if you increase the deadliness of the virus by 50%, you would end up with the green line of deaths, right? That's just by increasing the mortality rate. But if you increase the infectivity rate, and these new variants are 50% more infective, what happens is you get more people infected, more people that are infected infect more people, and the bigger that size of infection gets, the more aggregate deaths you get. So on an individual basis, you would prefer a more infectious virus if you were living on your own. But if you're living in a population, you certainly don't want a more infectious virus, as many of us are. So this is the reason we're concerned about the variants. And much of this is played out in South Africa across the Eastern Cape. So the important message around mortality versus infectiousness of the variants. Moving on to the very hot topic for the moment, vaccines. I get tons of vaccines questions every day, and rightly so. We all want to get the vaccine as quickly as possible. The good news is we can now see, touch, and feel vaccines, and we will shortly have vaccines in South Africa. So this is a very nice picture of the Moderna vaccine, the first vaccine to be approved. It's manufactured in the US by a Boston-based company. And as you can see in that box there, saying to an earlier group, it looks almost like a sleeve of golf balls that you could put in that box. There's 10 vials in a box, and each of the vials has 10 doses. So that box of vaccine would be enough to vaccinate 100 people. How's that for compact? 100 people could get vaccinated out of that box. And when you begin to expand that to say South Africa needs somewhere in the order of 55 to 60 million doses of vaccines, and you divide that by 100 per box, you can begin to see, actually we're going to need, about 60,000 of these boxes to get South Africa vaccinated. I hope 600,000, my apologies, 600,000 of these boxes to get South Africa vaccinated. So it's a big logistical exercise, but certainly not an insurmountable challenge. And the good news with South Africa is we have a very good pharmaceutical and medical product logistics system. We also have a very good healthcare system. Despite all of the challenges we have in the healthcare system, we have a lot of doctors, we have a lot of nurses, we have a lot of healthcare facilities, and are certainly much better equipped than many other countries globally. We also have a well-established vaccine system for kids, and most of your kids would have been vaccinated, and you would have been vaccinated at some point. Okay. So where do we sit in vaccine rollout globally? There's a lot of panic around when am I going to get the vaccine? Why don't I have it yet? The reality is all countries are in the very, very early stages of vaccine rollout. Very early stages of vaccine rollout. So for instance, the US, as of yesterday, I think is vaccinated somewhere around 5% of their population. So it's moving very, very slow, getting the US vaccinated. All other countries are way, way behind the US. The only country that's made really good inroads in vaccination is Israel. Israel is moving up to 30 or 40% of their population vaccinated, but that becomes a lot easier if your population is only 8 million people. And Israel is a tiny country geographically. So Israel is far ahead of the curve. We're in a similar boat. So Africa still looks white, which is admittedly concerning. But at the same time, we're in a similar boat to Australia and to New Zealand. So if you look down the bottom right-hand side of the slide here, Australia's vaccination program and New Zealand's vaccination programs only kick off towards the end of March and the beginning of April. End of March, beginning of April, that's when they're starting their vaccination campaigns. That's when they're receiving vaccines. So we, in fact, interestingly enough, will receive vaccine in South Africa in the next week or two. It's been procured out of India. We'll come all the way from India to South Africa, and our color will change from white to yellow in, in the next week or two. And then we need to ramp up fast, and that's the work that we're doing at the moment. So, where are countries at the moment? As I said, the US is at about 5% of the population vaccinated. What's very interesting about the US is they are delivering 800,000 doses a day. 800,000 doses a day. Isn't that remarkable? The UK is delivering 400,000 doses a day and has vaccinated close to 6% of its population. But I think the important thing for me on this slide is these programs have been running for about a month. And if we just take the US example, 5% of the population in a month, if you continue at that pace, 5% per month, it's going to take you the better part. You're going to end up with 60% of your population in a year. So these programs just take time to roll out. I had an interesting conversation with a colleague of mine in New York last night. She's roughly the same age as me. I'm going to let you guess how old I am. Not too old, not too young, Goldilocks old, I guess. She is number 280 millionth in the queue to get her vaccine in the US. She's in the middle of New York, roughly my age. She's number 280 million in the queue, and then some change, which means that she will get vaccinated somewhere around October this year. And my expectation is, if we can get our program going, I would expect to get vaccinated somewhere around October as well. So these programs just take time to roll out. The good news is that there are many vaccines in development. So you'll see there's a pipeline of over 150 vaccines that are being explored. There's a pipeline of about 50 vaccines that are in various stages of clinical trials and experiments. And these are the important ones to watch. These 13 vaccines here that are in phase 3 trials. Phase 3 trials is the last phase of trials. That's human trials. And typically they would include somewhere around anywhere between 30 and 60,000 people who they test vaccines on. 13 vaccines in that. And then this actually needs to be updated. We've got 3 vaccines approved. So it's the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, the Moderna vaccine that you saw a picture of earlier on, and the AstraZeneca vaccine. So 3 approved vaccines, which is great news. And then we need to highlight that there are vaccines out of China. So the Sino vaccine, as an example, that has been approved for use in China and some other countries, but they haven't received FDA approval or European Union approval, or not South Africa approval. So. And they also haven't extensively published their data, which is what you do in medical sciences. You publish your data, everyone interrogates your data, checks whether it makes sense, and on the back of that, you kind of get approvals. The Chinese vaccine has not done that yet, and nor has the Russian vaccine. So as a result, we'd be nervous to use those vaccines we certainly wouldn't use those vaccines until we've seen the data and until we're comfortable that they're both safe and efficacious. But the good news here is that there is a very nice pipeline of vaccines on the way. There's also good production of vaccines busy building up. So the AstraZeneca vaccine, for example, is projecting somewhere around 3 billion doses per annum. 3 billion doses, remembering it's a 2-dose vaccine, gets to vaccinate 1.5 billion people globally. So big production coming out of AstraZeneca. Novavax is the Indian vaccine approved for use in India. In fact, interestingly, South Africa was part of the Novavax trial. So, we've had some Novavax stock in South Africa, and so some South African people who've been part of that trial were part of Novavax. The results are still outstanding, but we're confident that they're going to be good. Novavax will be another 2.1 million doses, also a 2-dose vaccine. And then Pfizer has got somewhere around 1.3 to 1.5 million doses. The Chinese vaccine, as I mentioned on the previous page, 1.4, and so on and so forth. So if you add up these 3 big players here, 3.4 plus 3, that gives you 6.4. 6.4 divided by 2 is 3.2. Those 3 big players there vaccinate close on half of the world's population. And Pfizer is approved globally, largely globally. Novavax is approved in India, and AstraZeneca is largely approved globally. So this is a very promising sign. The stock that rises in South Africa next week, incidentally, is the AstraZeneca vaccine. And then we're in discussions here with Pfizer as well, and we're in discussions with Johnson & Johnson. Okay, how will the program roll out in South Africa? 3 phases. And I think the important thing is that the public and private sector are working together on this campaign. So we are working hand in hand with colleagues across business in South Africa and colleagues across the National Department of Health and Provincial Department of Health to roll out this program. And there's a very specific reason that we're working together to roll out the program. The first and most important reason is we need to drive equitable access of vaccines. So South Africa, for a variety of reasons, runs a 2-tiered healthcare system, a public system and a private system. And that's problematic in that the private system often runs more efficiently than the public system, primarily because it's smaller and more manageable, but also because it's better resourced. And if we embark on a vaccination campaign where it runs as a 2-tier system, then the private system, we will end up with inequitable access. And that is really problematic for me personally. I think it's real problematic. It should be problematic for us as a society in that you would end up in a situation where a young, healthy 30-year-old medical scheme member gets a vaccine before a 70-year-old person who relies on the public sector for care, who doesn't have a medical scheme. And I can't reconcile that in my mind. And I think we've got to drive equitable access around vulnerable groups first. We've also got to make sure that our healthcare workers get vaccinated first. Without healthcare workers, we're going to see many more deaths and we're going to see worse outcomes. So in phase 1, it's all about healthcare workers and all about health sector workers. So a health sector worker, for example, would be a receptionist in a doctor's practice, a cleaner in a doctor's practice. Isn't that a nice example? Right, a cleaner in a doctor's practice, in all likelihood wouldn't have a medical aid, but through this program, that cleaner gets access to vaccine at the same time as the doctor gets access to the vaccine. That's what equitable access is about. So that's our priorities here. Phase 1, get our healthcare workers and health sector workers vaccinated. Phase 2 is about 2 main population groups. Firstly, essential workers. And we're working on the definition for essential workers now. These are people that keep our economy going. Teachers, police officers, firemen, core municipal services, sewage, water. Those are essential healthcare workers. And then people over the age of 60, so vulnerable populations. Your father, your mother, grandfathers, grandmothers, and so on and so forth. We know that mortality rates are high in those population. And then people with comorbidities, so people who are suffering from various other ailments. And then it's a phase 3 with all the rest of the folks. And I would fit into this phase 3, and I'm very comfortable fitting into phase 3 because I know healthcare workers come before me in the queue, and that makes sense. I know that essential workers come before me. I'm lucky enough to be working from home. And I would certainly want to see my mom and my dad vaccinated before I'm vaccinated. So I'm very comfortable sitting in a phase 3. And then importantly, we've got this whole other category of people under the age of 18. So the vaccine is not approved for use in children yet. So, and the reason for that is we haven't tested the vaccine in kids. The clinical trials predominantly were for people over the age of 18. So we know that it's safe and efficacious in people over the 18. People under the age of 18, we think it's going to be fine, but we've got to make sure that the evidence is placed, and those trials have just kicked off now. Okay, so what does the rollout look like? This is a very preliminary and brand new slide. It got developed yesterday. This is our initial first view on what vaccine supply could look like in South Africa. Much of the supply needs to be confirmed, so don't read this as a confirmed slide. This is a projection around what a reasonable rollout would look like, so long as we can confirm supply with global manufacturers. But it gives us a good sense on how the rollout would ramp up over time, whether our system would cope with this number of vaccines over time, and most importantly, what percentage, this red line here, of the target population would get vaccinated over time. So as you see, if this supply plays out, we would then end up with 71% of target population vaccinated by the end of the year. And that's a very realistic and doable scenario, notwithstanding the complexity of getting this done, and we're all rallying to get this done. But we're not happy with 71%, so we've got a scenario that says, how do we get to 100% by the end of the year? So this is the trajectory for getting us to 100% by the end of the year. So that's our stretch target for 2021, and we certainly want to meet our president's ambitious goals of getting 100% vaccinated by the end of the year. And a big difference between that and that. There's a second scenario in between where we are considering there's a potential for us to accelerate some of the Pfizer supply, and we're looking at whether we could potentially accommodate the Pfizer vaccine in South Africa. Remember, the Pfizer vaccine needs to be stored at -70 degrees Celsius, -70 degrees Celsius. And the reality is there just aren't enough fridges globally, let alone in South Africa, for -70 storage capacity. So we're trying to figure out how we make this Pfizer front-loaded strategy work. Working very closely with all of the logistics groups and and our Department of Health colleagues on this. Okay. How will you get the vaccine? So the supply chain is actually pretty simple. So what we do is government puts in some money, medical schemes put in some money, and then there's business who will put in some money as well. We buy vaccines from the various manufacturers. We then have a very important planning and stock allocation system that is a public-private partnership. Discovery is intricately involved in that, and our actuaries are supporting around the analytics and planning and data assimilation. This is very important because this decides how much stock goes down the public sector distribution and how much stock goes down the private sector distribution. Private sector distribution then ends up with private providers. Public sector distribution ends up with public providers, so public hospitals, public clinics, of which we have many in South Africa, by the way. Over 30,000 primary care clinics in South Africa. The private providers includes the likes of, we will certainly look to support Discovery members and Discovery clients, of which many of you are as part of the COVID business support solution around mass vaccination sites. So it's something we're already beginning to work on in collaboration with the National Department of Health and various other players. And then it would make sense to leverage the pharmacies, Clicks, Discam, the independent pharmacies, and then of course our hospital partners. So if you're you would then likely access vaccines through any one of these points in accordance with the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 rollout. So as I explained a bit earlier on, my colleague in New York, 280 millionth in the queue, somewhere around October. Maybe my appointment is around October at a Discam or at a Netcare or at one of the sites we set up with one of our partners. So that's broadly speaking how it would work. To finish up the presentation, a few quick messages around staying safe. I presented this slide before. I love bringing it back. It's a common sewing needle. The point of a common sewing needle, that tip is 1 millimeter in diameter. On the tip of that sewing needle, you could fit 10,000 coronavirus particles, 10,000 coronavirus particles. That illustrates for you how small the coronavirus is. It's 100 nanometers, 10,000 particles on the tip of a sewing needle. As a result, what happens is if you blow that tip of a sewing needle, what happens? Well, it flies off like dandelions. And as we all know, dandelions, in fact, there's one out in my, that's very ironic, one out in my garden right now, flies off into the atmosphere and then lands at some point. And the coronavirus spreads in exactly the same way. It flies off into the atmosphere and then lands because it's typically part of a respiratory droplet. But it does spend some time in the air. And then you inhale that coronavirus particle, goes into your body, it then begins to replicate, and your immune system goes ahead and attacks it, and that's where you get all the symptoms around your coronavirus. So how do we prevent it? This is my favorite prevention slide. It's called the Swiss cheese model. And the Swiss cheese model is, here's the coronavirus on the left-hand side here. What you do, you put layers of barriers in place to prevent you from getting it. So if the coronavirus gets through your first prevention barrier and your second one and your third one, at least it gets blocked by the fourth one. And if you, take that to physical distances, the most important, first barrier. Stay home if you're sick. Masks, critical barrier. Hand hygiene, touching your face, staying away from crowds, testing, and then you're moving to the medical intervention. So these are your personal responsibilities. These are shared responsibilities around testing, ventilation, government messaging, quarantine, isolation. And where are vaccines? The last layer of cheese. So we're now hitting kind of the last layer of our strategy. But for the strategy to be effective, you need all layers in place, all at the same time. So we can't take away the initial layers while we're doing the vaccination campaign. So the good news is we're now towards the last layer around the Swiss cheese model. This is a close-up picture of a mask. It's a 50 micrometer picture of a mask. It's an electron micrograph, just to give you a sense on how small this picture is or how microscopic this picture is. There's a speck of dust. That little thing there is a speck of dust. Only reason I put this picture up is to illustrate for you why masks are so effective. Can you imagine if you're a coronavirus particle or a respiratory droplet and you've got to try and get through this maze or this mesh? They're virtually impossible. And that's why I'm such a big fan of masks. My kids love masks. My family loves masks. We really have got used to it over time. It's any mask is effective, by the way. Cloth mask, surgical face mask, N95. They all work. So find something that's convenient, that's easy to use. Make sure that your nose is covered. If you get coronavirus, this is a very scary picture. So he has a normal lung on the left-hand side of the page. He has a smoker's lung, a heavy smoker's lung, and he has a coronavirus or COVID lung. And I think we would all agree, you don't have to be a doctor to see the differences between these lungs. You certainly don't want to be in this position here, and this is what COVID can do to your lungs. It doesn't happen to everyone. We end up with lots of asymptomatic infections as well, and lots of mild infections. But it can end up in this space, and I certainly have managed a number of patients and members over the last few weeks who've had severe infections like this person on the right-hand side there. And then finally, Captain South Africa, our President Ramaphosa, just a reminder about the COVID Alert app. The COVID Alert app is a very powerful tool that Discovery built in collaboration with the Department of Health. I call it my green passport. When it's green, it means I haven't had any exposure. It works remarkably well. It's an early alert system for you to protect other people from infection and raise awareness around you potentially getting infected. Very, very powerful and useful tool. My wife actually had an orange notification in December, and that allowed us to put her into quarantine and get her testing at the right time, which we wouldn't have known if it hadn't turned orange. And then finally, a quick update on Discovery. As always, this has been our mantra all along. We like to remind ourselves of what we're doing. Our 3 priorities: protect our people, protect our clients, protect South Africa. We've done extensive work on protecting our people. We're working alongside you and many other clients to make sure that you're able to protect your employees, protect yourself, protect your communities. We continue to innovate here and work as hard as possible to find additional solutions. As I say, we're working on the vaccination campaign, which really forms part of this circle too. And then on protecting South Africa, we've done COVID Alert, which is one of the many things that we've worked on, but are now working on the national vaccination campaign as well. So lots of frenetic activity happening within the Discovery stable. As always, there's no rest for the wicked here, but it really meets our core purpose of keeping people healthy and enhancing and protecting their lives, making people healthy and enhancing and protecting their lives. And that is the story for today. I hope that's a useful update. I know we covered a lot of ground. Happy to take any questions if helpful and useful.
Right. Thank you for that very comprehensive view, Ron. I think we can all agree on the call that it was hugely insightful and valuable, and also quite easy to understand. We have received a flood of questions. Naturally, a lot of those center around the vaccine, lots of concerns around the vaccine, but we also have a few other questions that sort of sit out of the vaccine. The one that comes up, obviously, is just how do we, as responsible citizens, respond to a large cohort of anti-vaxxers out there? There's obviously lots of myths and misinformation around the vaccine. What should be our position as really responsible citizens to individuals who are committed to perpetuating these myths?
Yeah, it's a very sad fact, the extensive sort of negative sentiment. And I think you're perpetuated by a lot of ill truths across your social media. So I think the first thing is be very cautious, as with anything around your social media, around your fake news. You always ask the question a few times, and certainly take your counsel and advice from your health professional colleagues who would be able to dismay many of those myths. I think the important thing on this is, as you would have seen, these vaccines have been developed by some of the biggest and most established companies globally. So companies that have been around for many, many decades have scientists, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of scientists within those companies, have hundreds of doctors and healthcare workers. Those are the people that have developed the vaccines. It's scientists, it's doctors who've developed these vaccines. I think in addition to that, as I said, these vaccines have been tested across your big population groups. So trials are anywhere between 40,000 people and 60,000 people on a trial. And these vaccines are only approved if two things are met. One is, are they safe? Are there any major side effects or deleterious events? And two is, are they effective? If a vaccine does not meet those hurdles, it will not get approved. In fact, we heard earlier this week that GSK and Sanofi have pulled back their vaccine on the back of some concern around their initial trial data. And I think it just illustrates the rigor of the system for approving vaccines. And then I think also just worth mentioning, vaccines have been around for many moons. They're a very tried and tested approach here to healthcare. In fact, I would argue that vaccines are probably the most, a much more natural way of preventing disease than many pharmaceutical ingredients are. And the reason for that is a vaccine basically elicits your own immune response. So it just sort of probes your immune system to produce your own antibodies. They're your antibodies that you produce to any infection exposure. And so it's very natural process. There's no, quite a lot around, we're injecting chips and there's 5G, and I mean, it's just it's not true, not true at all. Certainly, we would advocate vaccines. I would advocate vaccines in my personal and professional capacity as well. At the same time, I think we trust our regulators to ensure that we get effective vaccines in place, and we certainly are watching the numbers closely, and we wouldn't make an unsafe vaccine or any other medication available to members.
Great, thank you for that response. We obviously will have access to quite a number of different vaccines. The questions that comes to mind is, are all vaccines equal? I mean, are they all equally effective, all equally safe? Should there be any concern around which vaccine one has access to?
Yeah, what a good question. So the answer to vaccine registration is they all need to meet a minimum standard. So they all need to meet a minimum standard of effectiveness. And typically, across other vaccines globally, if you're above 70% effective, then you're effective on a population basis. The great news on the COVID vaccines is that they are well above 70%. They're amazing. The Moderna and Pfizer vaccines are well above 95% effective. Yes, that means that they prevent 95 out of 100 infections, which is remarkable in vaccine technology. The AstraZeneca vaccine, is over 90% effective, based on the dosing regimes. So I think the bar has been set very high for COVID vaccines. And then obviously we're watching the safety features of all of the vaccines closely. Incidentally, often there's always minor side effects to vaccine, slight irritation, but the major side effects are very, very far in between across all of the vaccines that have been launched so far.
Right. Ron, the actual vaccine drive, the question coming up is, will it be compulsory for the population to take the vaccine? And linked to that question, if it isn't compulsory, how do you think we deal with healthcare workers who may decline to take the vaccine? And what implications would that have on our own safety as a population?
Yes, a very good two-layered question. Certainly from what we've seen so far is that healthcare workers are by and large putting up their hands for vaccines. And I think healthcare workers understand the science and understand the experience in vaccines over many years. So we're certainly not seeing swaths of anti-vaxxer sentiment across healthcare workers. And I think that's a very important indication for the public and for employers to be aware of. The healthcare workers are putting up their hand. They're actually the same, bring it faster. So I think we'll get a good uptake across your healthcare workers. I think across the rest of the population, we will struggle a little bit with vaccine sentiment. But people will not be forced to take the vaccine. This is a medical treatment. You can't make it compulsory. And I think that is one of the amazing things about South Africa is the strength of the constitution. It will not be obligatory, but it will be strongly encouraged. If not to protect you, to protect your family, to protect your co-workers, to protect your friends, to protect your community. Remember, if you don't get vaccinated, then you then get infected and infect other people who are still waiting in the queue to get vaccinated. That's not ideal. So strongly encourage. We would certainly endorse any vaccine that is registered in South Africa will be part of that registration process. The National Department of Health and government will endorse vaccines and encourage them strongly. And I know that scientists across South Africa and medical professionals across South Africa would endorse vaccines. The converse of your point around healthcare workers not getting vaccinated is equally true if a healthcare worker comes into contact with someone who hasn't been vaccinated, right? So we also need to get vaccinated to protect our healthcare workers.
Fair point. Ron, obviously the bulk of our participants today are leaders of employer groups who not only care about the greater population, but also care about what all of this means for their own business. The question that's coming up is there an opportunity for employers to run vaccine drives? And how would that look like? Would they have access to some vaccines? Could they procure it themselves on a Force for Social Good initiative if they were to give back to the community? But what opportunities are there for employers to play a more active role in this space?
Yeah, excellent question. And we get a lot of questions around, and it's it's amazingly heartwarming to see. I get employers calling on a daily basis and saying, how can I help? How do I get vaccine faster? I'd like to vaccinate my workforce. It's amazing. Just the outpouring across South Africa is incredible. And I know many folks on this webinar are in that category. A few important points. One is we need to drive equitable access to vaccines. So we need to follow this chain of healthcare workers, then essential workers, and higher risk populations than the rest of us. So I think that's the meta framework for the South African rollout. So any employer program would follow the same meta frame. Right? Yes. If you've got healthcare workers, well then you're in phase 1. If you've got essential workers, then you're in phase 2. You may have a business that has a mix of those. You may have some healthcare workers, some essential workers, and some of the rest of us. Incidentally, Discovery has that frame. We have healthcare workers, we have essential workers, and we have the rest of us. Now, even though I'm a doctor, I don't do clinical practice, so I wouldn't put myself into your category 1. So you've got to think of that same meta frame around your workforce. The second important point is that, and I've had this question quite a lot, can I import vaccines into South Africa and inject them into my staff? It's a very, very dangerous thing. Not only is it illegal, it's a dangerous thing to do. And I just want to make sure that you're aware of the risks on that front. So firstly, you can't be sure, you need to be damn sure where you're getting the vaccine from. So what we find in vaccines and in pharmaceutical products globally is there's a lot of gray products. And I think this is a real risk in the global vaccine market, is that we will end up with a lot of gray vaccines that look and feel like an approved vaccine, but are not. So you need to be very, very cautious of that. The second thing is that until a vaccine is registered in South Africa and you have the requisite license to import and distribute that vaccine in South Africa, it's illegal to parallel import any medical products or vaccines. And there's if you were to do that, and let me just apply out the ramifications. If you were to import your vaccine, if it's from a reliable source, and for instance, you vaccinated your workforce and one person had an adverse reaction and ended up in an ICU, the regulator would come and say, well, who imported the vaccine? And how do you know it was safe? And why is your license? And that becomes a very complicated place to be. And we certainly wouldn't want to see any of our clients in that place. So please work alongside us and our B4SA colleagues to accelerate reliable, safe vaccines into South Africa. If we work together, we can accelerate the procurement, we can accelerate the distribution, we can accelerate the vaccination campaigns, but we've got to work together on this to have the best chance of success. So please be cautious on that front. And I can guarantee you we're working hard across all sectors of South African industry and government to help accelerate.
Wonderful. We are quickly going to run out of time, but before I maybe pose the last question to you, Ron, I just want to assure our audience that we will be sharing a recording of this webinar. We'll also be sending you links to the webinar in the thank you email that will be circulated either later this afternoon or tomorrow morning. So rest assured you will have access and reference to this session. Ron, if we move away slightly from the vaccine, there are many other questions that we couldn't cover. The one thing that's also coming up quite strongly is this alternative treatment in the ivermectin or the Ivermex. The audience is curious to know what your personal thoughts are on that treatment alternative.
So three very brief points on this. The first one is that ivermectin is not approved for use in humans in South Africa. So using ivermectin in humans is against the regulations. So that's and there's a very good reason for that. In that it's been evaluated over the years, and the efficacy for a number of other conditions is not required registration in South Africa. The second important point on the flip side of that is that the initial research on ivermectin does look good. Admittedly, it does look good. The problem with the initial research is that it's on a very small sample. So it's about 3,000 people. And 3,000 people, as I mentioned in the vaccine section, that's too small a sample to extrapolate population impact, right? You need to have a sample of 20, 30, 40,000 people to understand how safe and effective is a vaccine and a drug on a population basis. So those studies are underway at the moment, and we're hoping to see some more ivermectin results in the next 2 weeks. The WHO has accelerated all of the ivermectin research. And believe me, I'm fingers crossed and thumbs held that that research is going to say it works. for the moment, we need to hang back a little bit. The third story I'll tell you very briefly is my uncle is a farmer, so I got my first view of what ivermectin looks like last week, where he brought it out. He said, I found the wonder drug. And he brought out a bottle of ivermectin, a white bottle. And I said to him, well, he said, well, what do you think? I said, well, why don't we read the label? And if you read the label for ivermectin, firstly, it says for animal use only, not for human consumption. Secondly, it says for intramuscular injection, right? So that means you've got to inject it. And thirdly, the doses are for animals, for horses and for cows. So I said to him, well, not approved, for animals, dose wrong, intramuscular injection. How are you going to take it? He said, well, here's the dose on the side of the thing. I'm going to drink it. I'm like, but you're supposed to inject it. Yeah, but I'll just drink it. And when we went through what happens if you drink it and what happens if you end up with a side effect and will it actually work? So I think that's a dangerous place to be. Needless to say, my uncle put the bottle of ivermectin back in his veterinary medicine storage cabinet, and he said to me, let him know when the research is published and when it's registered, and then we can look again. So there's a little anecdote for you around ivermectin. I would be cautious for now. I certainly wouldn't be taking it prophylactically for now. I wouldn't be taking it as treatment for now. But hopefully in a month's time, I can tell you something different. But we always work on facts and figures within discovery. And in fact, across South Africa, our scientists always look at the data first. So definitely not.
Thank you for that voice of reason. I think quite a few of the audience members probably had it halfway down their throats at this point, it would sound like. We are officially out of time, and I just want to thank everyone who participated in this webinar for availing themselves. We trust that you found it insightful, but also useful. We aim to have this on an ongoing basis, and we do invite you to join us in the near future. We were overwhelmed with the number of questions, so we do apologize for the questions we didn't get to. Lots of questions around the benefits with the different schemes. We acknowledge them, and we'll look to circulate an FAQ to answer those. Wishing you all a great afternoon further, and a huge thank you to Dr. Ron for sharing his insight and expertise on this very important topic. Do have a blessed afternoon.